What do the US politicians who are anti-South Africa have in common? There's a handful of politicians in the US Congress who have been most vocal about pushing for South Africa to be sanctioned by the Trump administration. When you dig a little deeper, you'll find most of them have something in common: the source of their funding. I'm Rebecca Davis, senior journalist for Daily Maverick. In February this year, 4 US congressmen wrote to President Trump urging him to do something about South Africa, specifically asking him to scrap AGOA, the trade agreement which gives South African exporters the right to sell their goods to America at a more attractive price than other countries can. The letter used extremely aggressive language to get its point across, accusing the ANC of running an ethno-nationalist gangster regime. It cited a number of sins on the part of the South African government: its supposedly destructive land reform program, its failure to manage gender-based violence, but also its, quote, vendetta against the State of Israel. It highlighted South Africa's approach to the International Court of Justice to have Israel's actions in Gaza labeled as genocide, and called that a baseless claim. It also accused the South African government of acting as Hamas propagandists for decades. Now, the 4 congressmen who signed this letter were all Republicans. Andy Ogles is a Republican from Tennessee, Tom Tiffany is a Republican from Wisconsin, Joe Wilson is a Republican from South Carolina, and Don Bacon is a Republican from Nebraska. But that's not the only thing they have in common. A website called OpenSecrets.org tracks money in American politics, who's giving it and who's receiving it. Now, the amount of money flowing around American politics is hard to wrap your head around for non-Americans. And the main reason for this is a famous Supreme Court ruling in 2010 known as the Citizens United ruling, which basically removed all restrictions on how much money corporations and special interest groups can spend on elections. In most countries, there are strict limits on how much money you can donate to one candidate or campaign, because of how badly it skews politics in favor of whoever has the largest wallet. In South Africa, for instance, you cannot donate more than 15 million rand to one party in a single calendar year. But ever since the Citizens United ruling in the States, it has been legal to spend unlimited amounts of money supporting candidates and their campaigns. And around 90% of US electoral races are simply won by whoever spends the most money. On the website Open Secrets, you can see who the biggest donors are to individual senators or members of the House of Representatives. So I took a look at what has been going on with the campaign financing of these 4 congressmen who are pushing an anti-South African agenda. Let's start with Don Bacon. Don Bacon, it turns out, received the highest amount of money in the most recent financial year from which there are records from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, which we'll come back to. He received almost $700,000 from that body, which is close to 13 million rand. The top industry from which Don Bacon received funding is listed as pro-Israel. Let's go to another one of the 4, Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson received the highest amount of money in the most recent financial year from which there are records from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. He received $126,350, or about 2.3 million. That leaves Tom Tiffany and Andy Ogles. Tom Tiffany's most recent biggest donor was something called Incredible Bank, which doesn't fit our pattern. But if you look at Tom Tiffany's funding from the previous cycle, you'll find his biggest donor was AIPAC, to the tune of almost $34,000, or around 626,000 rand. The last congressman to sign that letter was Andy Ogles. AIPAC is not listed as one of Ogles' donors in the last campaign cycle, and Open Secrets doesn't have records for his previous round of financing. But AIPAC lists Ogles as one of its featured candidates on its own website, so it's fair to assume that it has donated money to his campaign before. So let's sum it up. Of the 4 congressmen who signed a letter calling for South Africa to face punitive action, 3 out of 4 had the same biggest single donor at some point since 2022, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and the 4th has also received funding from AIPAC. But here's where it gets tricky. AIPAC funds hundreds of American politicians each year. To be specific, in 2024, they supported 361 candidates from both the Republican and Democratic parties to the tune of more than $53 million. They're open about why they do this. They say on their website that they are, quote, transparently tying contributions to candidates' support for Israel. They also say, quote, we base our support only on a candidate's support for the US-Israel relationship. In other words, they are a single-issue funding group, and that issue is support for Israel. Support Israel, and you can expect AIPAC to fund your campaign. So the 4 congressmen who received funding from AIPAC and went on to propose legislation punishing South Africa in part for its stance on Israel aren't even exceptional. They are 4 among 361 others last year cashing in from AIPAC. But it is noticeable that 3 of the 4 had AIPAC as their single biggest donor at some point since 2022. In other words, they might have a proportionately bigger reason to push hard on pro-Israel policies. It's important to say that none of this is improper in terms of US politics. Anyone is allowed to set up fundraising vehicles for any issue and use that to channel money to politicians. But if you have been wondering why US politicians across the political spectrum seem to be so reluctant to take a stance against Israel, it's important, as so often in politics, to follow the money.